In 1453 Constantinople was taken by the Turks, and many Greek scholars with their manuscripts fled into Italy, where they began teaching their language and literature, and especially the philosophy of Plato. There had been little or no knowledge of Greek in western Europe during the Middle Ages, and only a very imperfect knowledge of the Latin classics. Ovid and Statius were widely read, and so was the late Latin poet Boethius, whose De Consolatione Philosophiae had been translated into English by King Alfred and by Chaucer. Little was known of Virgil at first hand, and he was popularly supposed to have been a mighty wizard, who made sundry works of enchantment at Rome, such as a magic mirror and statue. Caxton's so-called translation of the Aeneid was in reality nothing but a version of a French romance based on Virgil's epic. Of the Roman historians, orators, and moralists, such as Livy, Tacitus, Caesar, Cicero, and Seneca, there was an almost entire ignorance, as also of poets like Horace, Lucretius, Juvenal, and Catullus. The gradual rediscovery of the remains of ancient art and literature, which took place in the 15th century, and largely in Italy, worked an immense revolution in the mind of Europe. Manuscripts were brought out of their hiding places, edited by scholars, and spread abroad by means of the printing press. Statues were dug up and placed in museums, and men became acquainted with a civilization far more mature than that of the Middle Age, and with models of perfect workmanship in letters and the fine arts. In the latter years of the 15th century a number of Englishmen learned Greek in Italy and brought it back with them to England. William Grocyn and Thomas Linacre, who had studied at Florence under the refugee Demetrius Chalcondylas, began teaching Greek at Oxford, the former as early as 1491. A little later, John Colet, Dean of St. Paul's and the founder of St. Paul's School, and his friend William Lilly, the grammarian and first master of St. Paul's (1500), also studied Greek abroad, Colet in Italy, and Lilly at Rhodes and in the city of Rome. Thomas More, afterward the famous Chancellor of Henry VIII., was among the pupils of Grocyn and Linacre at Oxford. Thither also, in 1497, came in search of the new knowledge the Dutchman Erasmus, who became the foremost scholar of his time. From Oxford the study spread to the sister university, where the first English Grecian of his day, Sir Jonathan Cheeke, who taught Cambridge and King Edward Greek, became the incumbent of the new professorship founded about 1540. Among his pupils were Roger Ascham, already mentioned, in whose time St. John's College, Cambridge, was the chief seat of the new learning, of which Thomas Nash testifies that it was an university within itself, having more candles light in it every winter morning before 4 of the clock than the 4 of the clock bell gave strokes. Greek was not introduced at the universities without violent opposition from the conservative element, who were nicknamed Trojans. The opposition came in part from the priests, who feared that the new study would sow seeds of heresy. Yet many of the most devout churchmen were friends of a more liberal culture, among them Thomas More, whose Catholicism was undoubted, and who went to the block for his religion. Cardinal Wolsey, whom More succeeded as Chancellor, was also a munificent patron of learning, and founded Christ Church College at Oxford. Popular education at once felt the impulse of the new studies, and over 20 endowed grammar schools were established in England in the first 20 years of the 16th century. Greek became a passion even with the English ladies. Ascham, in his Schoolmaster, a treatise on education published in 1570, says that Queen Elizabeth readeth here now at Windsor more Greek every day than some prebendary of this church doth read Latin in a whole week. And in the same book he tells how, calling once upon Lady Jane Grey at Brodegate in Leicestershire, he found her in her chamber reading Phaedon Platonis in Greek, and that with as much delight as some gentleman would read a merry tale in bouquets. And when he asked her why she had not gone hunting with the rest, she answered, I wis all their little sport in the park is but a shadow to that pleasure that I find in Plato. Ascham's Schoolmaster, as well as his earlier book, Toxophilus, a Platonic dialogue on archery, bristles with quotations from the Greek and Latin classics, and with that perpetual reference to the authority of antiquity on every topic that he touches, which remained the fashion in all serious prose down to the time of Dryden. One speedy result of the new learning was fresh translations of the Scriptures into English out of the original tongues. In 1525 William Tyndale printed at Cologne and Worms his version of the New Testament from the Greek. 10 years later Miles Coverdale made, at Zurich, a translation of the whole Bible from the German and the Latin. These were the basis of numerous later translations, and the strong, beautiful English of Tyndale's Testament is preserved for the most part in our Authorized Version. At first it was not safe to make or distribute these early translations in England. Numbers of copies were brought into the country, however, and did much to promote the cause of the Reformation. After Henry VIII had broken with the Pope, the new English Bible circulated freely among the people. Tyndale and Sir Thomas More carried on a vigorous controversy in English upon some of the questions at issue between the Church and the Protestants. Other important contributions to the literature of the Reformation were the homily sermons preached at Westminster and at Paul's Cross by Bishop Hugh Latimer, who was burned at Oxford in the reign of Bloody Mary. The English Book of Common Prayer was compiled in 1549 52. More was, perhaps, the best representative of a group of scholars who wished to enlighten and reform the Church from inside, but who refused to follow Henry VIII in his breach with Rome. Dean Colet and John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, belonged to the same company, and Fisher was beheaded in the same year with More, and for the same offense, namely, refusing to take the oath to maintain the act confirming the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his marriage with Anne Boleyn. More's philosophy is best reflected in his Utopia, the description of an ideal commonwealth modeled on Plato's Republic, and printed in 1516. The name signifies no place, autopos, and has furnished an adjective to the language. The Utopia was in Latin, but More's History of Edward V. and Richard III., written in 1513, though not printed till 1557, was in English. It is the first example in the tongue of a history as distinguished from a chronicle. That is, it is a reasoned and artistic presentation of an historic period, and not a mere chronological narrative of events. The first 3/4 of the 16th century produced no great original work of literature in England. It was a season of preparation, of education. The storms of the Reformation interrupted and delayed the literary Renaissance through the reigns of Henry VIII., Edward VI., and Queen Mary. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, a more settled order of things began, and a period of great national prosperity and glory. Meanwhile the English mind had slowly been assimilating the new classical culture, which was extended to all classes of readers by the numerous translations of Greek and Latin authors. A fresh poetic impulse came from Italy. In 1557 appeared Tottel's Miscellany, containing songs and sonnets by a new company of courtly makers. Most of the pieces in the volume had been written years before, by gentlemen of Henry VIII.'s court, and circulated in manuscript. The two chief contributors were Sir Thomas Wiat, at one time English ambassador to Spain, and that brilliant noble Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who was beheaded in 1547 for quartering the king's arms with his own. Both of them were dead long before their work was printed. The pieces in Tottel's Miscellany show very clearly the influence of Italian poetry. We have seen that Chaucer took subjects and something more from Boccaccio and Petrarch, but the sonnet, which Petrarch had brought to great perfection, was first introduced into England by Wiat. There was a great revival of sonneteering in Italy in the 16th century, and a number of Wiat's poems were adaptations of the sonnets and canzoni of Petrarch and later poets. Others were imitations of Horace's satires and epistles. Surrey introduced the Italian blank verse into English in his translation of 2 books of the Aeneid. The love poetry of Tottel's Miscellany is polished and artificial, like the models which it followed. Dante's Beatrice was a child, and so was Petrarch's Laura. Following their example, Surrey addressed his love complaints, by way of compliment, to a little girl of the noble Irish family of Geraldine. The amourists, or love sonneteers, dwelt on the metaphysics of the passion with a tedious minuteness, and the conventional nature of their sighs and complaints may often be guessed by an experienced reader from the titles of their poems. Description of the restless state of a lover, with suit to his lady to rue on his dying heart. Hell tormenteth not the damned ghost so sore as unkindness the lover. The lover prayeth not to be disdained, refused, mistrusted, nor forsaken, etc. The most genuine utterance of Surrey was his poem written while imprisoned in Windsor, a cage where so many a song-bird has grown vocal. And Wiat's little piece of 8 lines, of his return from Spain, is worth reams of his amatory affections. Nevertheless, the writers in Tottel's Miscellany were real reformers of English poetry. They introduced new models of style and new metrical forms, and they broke away from the mediaeval traditions which had hitherto obtained. The language had undergone some changes since Chaucer's time, which made his scansion obsolete. The accent of many words of French origin, like nature, courage, vertu, mater, had shifted to the first syllable, and the e of the final syllables s, n, ed, and e had largely disappeared. But the language of poetry tends to keep up archaisms of this kind, and in Stephen Hawes, who wrote a century after Chaucer, we still find such lines as these: "But he my strokes might right well endure, he was so great and huge of puissance." Hawes's practice is variable in this respect, and so is his contemporary Skelton's. But in Wiat and Surrey, who wrote only a few years later, the reader first feels sure that he is reading verse pronounced quite in the modern fashion. But Chaucer's example still continued potent. Spenser revived many of his obsolete words, both in pastorals and in his Faery Queene, thereby imparting an antique remoteness to his diction, but incurring Ben Jonson's censure that he writ no language. A poem that stands midway between Spenser and late mediaeval work of Chaucer's school, such as Hawes' Pastime of Pleasure, was the Induction contributed by Thomas Sackville, Lord Buckhurst, in 1563, to a collection of narrative poems called the Mirror for Magistrates. The whole series was the work of many hands, modeled upon Lydgate's Falls of Princes, taken from Boccaccio, and was designed as a warning to great men of the fickleness of fortune. The Induction is the only noteworthy part of it. It was an allegory, written in Chaucer's 7-line stanza, and described with a somber, imaginative power, the figure of Sorrow, her abode in the greasy lake of Avernus, and her attendants, Remorse, Dread, Old Age, etc. Sackville was the author of the first regular English tragedy, Gorboduc, and it was at his request that Ascham wrote the Schoolmaster,